Hi, I'm Reverend Keith Kron, Director of the Office of Bisexual, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Concerns. I also manage the Beyond Categorical Thinking program, a program for congregations who are in ministerial search or searching for a director of religious education. I want to talk to you about some of the biases we still see in our congregation. Let's begin with people of color. All too often in our congregations, when you say people of color, people think about ministers who are exclusively African American. We know that the umbrella is larger than that. We're also talking about ministers of Arab and Middle Eastern descent, ministers who are of Asian and Pacific Islander descent, ministers who are Latino, Latina, Hispanic, ministers who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, ministers of First Nations, Native American descent. The category encompasses much more than African Americans. But we also see some specific biases in our congregations. People are afraid that when they call a minister of color, the minister of color is going to be single issue. In fact, we often see the following scenario happen in a congregation when a congregation calls a minister of color. There are a group of people in the congregation who are delighted that the congregation is called a minister of color because finally now the congregation can have a real conversation about race and ethnicity and look at broadening its welcome to who comes into the congregation. There's another third of the congregation who kind of has a feeling of, well, now we've done it. Look at Exhibit A. We have a minister of color in our pulpit. We don't need to do any more. See, there's proof that we're not racist. And then there's the third group that says, I wonder if this is all the minister of color is ever going to preach about. Are we only going to hear sermons about racial issues? So the minister of color finds herself or himself in a very difficult place. There is a group in the congregation that wants them to talk about this all the time, a group that thinks they don't need to because they've already done it, and a group that thinks that they shouldn't talk about this. So the minister of color often doesn't talk about these issues because they're afraid if they bring it up, they'll be seen as only talking about this. There are other issues that minister of colors often face in the biases that people feel. People wondering if they'll be comfortable in their congregation. Do they know what they're getting themselves into? It's usually the congregation that's not quite sure what it's getting themselves into. And the good news is the UUA will be there to help congregations that call ministers of color in the process. But there are more biases than we think there are. One of the biases that still amazes me that we hear about is we have any number of people who think that a minister of color just isn't smart enough or qualified enough to be a minister of their congregation. Sad, but true. And as we know, all ministers have to go through the same credentialing process, regardless of who they are. Another group that we see biases around are around ministers with disabilities. People immediately think of a minister being someone who is blind, someone who's deaf, or in a wheelchair. But in fact, most of our ministers with disabilities don't have disabilities that are like that. We have ministers with sensory disabilities, ministers with hearing loss, minister with some vision impairment, ministers who need either a scooter or a cane to help get them around, ministers with multiple sclerosis or severe arthritis. We have ministers who have emotional disabilities, things like depression and addiction. Often these are controlled with medication or by going to meetings. The UUA would never clear a minister with an active drinking problem. Only ministers with records of sobriety are cleared for settlement. And we make sure that the ministers who are out there who have had a problem with alcohol or substance abuse have a record of sobriety before we send them out. We also have ministers with cognitive disabilities, ministers who have some sort of learning disability like dyslexia or attention deficit. Most of these ministers have figured out ways in which they are able to accommodate their learning disabilities and figure out how to lead lives just like people in our congregations with those disabilities do too. We also have ministers who have invisible disabilities, disabilities that we cannot see. Things like epilepsy, diabetes, things that people can control with medication and often aren't seen. One of the biases we do see around ministers with disabilities is that if the visibility is known, often the only thing people in the congregation will think about is that particular disability. If the disability is not known, there will be people in the congregation and not seen, people who assume that the person is finding some way not to work to their full potential, that they're not working hard enough. Even though they may know they have a disability, but because they can't see it, they often assume that it's not there. We've had ministers with disabilities face interesting challenges. We had a minister who was taking medication for depression. Someone discovered that he was taking medication for depression, and the minister asked him not to talk about his taking the medication. The reason he didn't want to do that is he didn't want the congregation so early in the ministry, this happened very early in the minister's settlement there, to think of this as the only thing they thought about when they thought about this particular minister. Could the person hold off and not talk about it? That raises a lot of conversation, but I was leading that in a BCT workshop one time, and one doctor reminded us all, well, how many of us here are on some medication that we don't tell everyone about? You should have seen the reaction of the people in the congregation. Apparently, there were a lot of them. Other things that we hear in particular around ministers with disability is that they don't have enough stamina. This often refers to workload. And one of the realities is we often ask all of our ministers to work too hard. One of the things that we should be asking is, how do people take care of themselves, regardless of whether they have a disability or not? We want a minister who is happy and feels like their workload is adequate for the job, as opposed to working all the time. Another area where we see bias is around ministers who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. In large part because people only think gay, lesbian, and if they think about bisexual and transgender, they haven't thought about it as much. There's a big concern that if we call a gay minister, we'll become known as a gay church. What we know is that when you call a minister, regardless of their sexual orientation, if the congregation is strong on bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender issues, the congregation will attract a lot of straight people, people who are looking for a church different from every other church they know. We haven't seen a church ever taken over because a minister called a gay church. We also see biases around bisexuality, where people think that the minister is promiscuous. That has not been true. What we continue to find is that the most promiscuous people we've had in our movement have been the married heterosexual ministers. We also have people saying they just don't know enough about transgender ministers and that the issue is too great for them. What I do know is that knowing the transgender ministers I know in our movement, we lose out by not giving them equal opportunity, and our congregations really miss some incredible people by excluding them in the search process. Another area where we often see bias is around women ministers. This is particularly true in larger congregations, people who feel they need a quote-unquote strong leader to lead the congregation, and it therefore must be a man. This is particularly true if a congregation already has a female as an associate minister. There is a striving for gender balance, when in fact what we hope you're looking for is the skills that you need, as opposed to just an image that you hope to project. We had a congregation in particular looking for a minister who would attract families to their congregation. Sadly for them, they thought the only person who could do this was a straight, white, male, married minister, when in fact ministers of all identities might be good for this, and there are undoubtedly some straight, white, male, married ministers who would be very bad at attracting families into congregations. We also see some bias around size. Now, some people think that a person being fat is a disability. Most people who are overweight do not consider this a disability. They consider it a size issue, and they get very offended if you assume that being large is a disability. We had a congregation where the minister was injured, who was a rather large man, while working out at the gym. The congregation was furious and said that if he were in better shape, he wouldn't have been injured. The reality is, if he hadn't been working out at the gym, he wouldn't have been injured. He would have been just fine had he not. People of all sizes do need to take care of themselves. And the question is not whether it's a disability, but how well can that person do the job. These are some of the biases we see. There are many, many more, many you would not expect. Many that are surprising. You would be surprised to hear a Unitarian Universalist say, the best way to keep any oppression in place is to assume it's not there, and to not talk about it, or to pretend it's not there. The best way to end oppression is to have real conversations about it, to be willing to engage in education, to get resources. If you need resources on any of these issues, please contact the Office of Bisexual, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Concerns, and we'll be happy to point you to the right place. Thank you.